When the first groups of German prisoners stepped off the transport buses and through the gates of American POW camps in 1943 and 1944, many of them still carried the last taste of the front on their tongues. Dry black bread, watery barley soup, maybe a thin slice of horse meat if they were lucky. Men captured in Tunisia had been half-starved for weeks as Rommel's supply lines collapsed. Those taken in Sicily or at Normandy had spent months living off rations cut down to the bone by the demands of a failing war economy. They expected that captivity would mean even less. For most of them, the propaganda hammered into their minds since 1939 painted a bleak picture. America was decadent, chaotic, collapsing under its own moral weakness. Its soldiers were said to be pampered, soft, barely capable of fighting without overwhelming material advantage. And its treatment of prisoners, they were told, would be harsh, if not brutal outright. So when the gates of places like Camp Butner in North Carolina, Camp Swift in Texas, or Camp Algona in Iowa closed behind them, they braced themselves for hunger. But the hunger never came. Instead, within hours of arrival, the guards marched them to mess halls larger than most Wehrmacht barracks. They smelled something they had not associated with captivity: fresh bread, roasted meat, the unmistakable warmth of potatoes baked in giant steel ovens. Inside, long tables were lined with tin trays, and behind the counter stood American cooks ladling out portions that made the prisoners stare. There was meat, actual meat, thick slices of beef or pork. There were boiled potatoes, green beans, onions, soft white bread, and coffee, hot coffee served without restriction. Many POWs froze, unable to reconcile the scene in front of them with everything they had been taught. A few whispered that it must be a trick, a temporary show to hide the true conditions. A handful refused to touch the food at first, convinced it was some kind of psychological tactic. But the guards simply shrugged and told them to eat. This was their meal. This was normal. What none of the new arrivals knew, at least not yet, was that the United States was following the Geneva Convention of 1929, a treaty Germany had also signed. Under its rules, POWs had to be fed the same rations issued to the detaining power's own soldiers. And American soldiers ate well, very well. In 1943-44, the U.S. military supplied its personnel with some of the most generous rations in the world. Nearly 4,000 calories a day, drawn from an industrial base overflowing with canned meats, flour, vegetables, and dairy. The prisoners were legally entitled to that same level of nutrition. The shock deepened when they compared their trays to their memories of the Eastern Front. Since late 1942, German supply chains into Russia had been strangled by distance, weather, and the Soviet offensives that destroyed stockpiles and rail yards. Daily rations for frontline infantrymen often fell below 1,800 calories. Some divisions resorted to soaking moldy bread in water to make it edible. Men in the 6th Army at Stalingrad had survived on a few spoonfuls of millet. In the winter of 1943-44, entire units butchered their horses for meat. Yet here, thousands of kilometers from home, in the hands of a supposed enemy, German soldiers found trays stacked with more food than they had seen in months. Letters home, carefully censored but still revealing, described the disbelief. One soldier wrote from Camp Butner, "We eat better here as prisoners than we did as free men on the front." Another, captured at Normandy, remarked, "The Americans feed us like we are their own troops." Not all could accept it. Some of the most loyal National Socialists insisted that the Americans were trying to weaken German resolve by giving them luxuries. But that explanation collapsed when the days became weeks and the meals never changed. Breakfast came with oatmeal, fruit, and coffee. Lunch brought meatloaf, stew, or sausages. Dinner offered fish, pork chops, thick soups, or beans with ham. The portions remained steady, even generous. And the prisoners began gaining weight, noticeably. At Camp Algona, medical staff reported that many POWs added 5 to 10 kilograms within their first 2 months of captivity. The new arrivals were not only fed well, they were fed consistently. Most had never known consistency on the front. For some, the shock was emotional. They had expected humiliation and starvation. Instead, they found routine, structure, and meals that reminded them of a pre-war life they thought long vanished. The discrepancy haunted them. How could the enemy give them more than their own army ever had? The answer they would soon learn was far larger than food. It lay in the industrial might of the United States, in the legal obligation of the Geneva Convention of 1929, a treaty Germany had also signed. In the contrast between two nations, one collapsing under the weight of a total war it could no longer support, and one surging forward with production that defied comprehension. But in those first hours, none of that mattered. All they knew was that captivity tasted very different from what they had imagined. And for the first time in years, many German soldiers sat down to a hot meal without fear of artillery, without the sting of hunger, and without the weight of a war slowly consuming their homeland. It was the beginning of a new reality, one that none of them had been prepared to believe. For the German POWs who had stumbled into American mess halls, expecting punishment and instead found abundance, the question that haunted them in the days that followed was simple. Why? Why would the United States, engaged in the largest war in its history, fighting across 2 oceans, supplying millions of soldiers, feed enemy captives so well? The answer, as they gradually discovered, had nothing to do with generosity and everything to do with the combination of legal obligation, industrial capacity, and a supply system unlike anything Germany had ever possessed. The foundation of it all was the Geneva Convention of 1929, which mandated that prisoners of war must receive rations equivalent to those of the detaining power's own troops. America took that requirement literally. German POWs were not merely given leftovers or wartime substitutes, they were issued the same core components that U.S. soldiers consumed every day: meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, milk, and coffee. The cooks preparing the food were not ordered to alter recipes or shorten portions. They simply made larger batches of what they normally prepared for American troops. This commitment stunned many German prisoners because wartime Germany had abandoned full compliance with the Geneva Convention almost as soon as the war began. On the Eastern Front especially, Soviet POWs were starved deliberately, and even Western POWs saw their rations decline drastically after 1943 as supply collapse spread across the Reich. To a Wehrmacht soldier, the idea that an enemy would follow the rules so strictly seemed naive at best and unbelievable at worst. But the United States wasn't acting out of idealism, it was acting out of strength. The American home front, powered by the world's largest industrial and agricultural base, produced food on a scale Europe could not imagine. In 1943 alone, the U.S. produced more than 8 billion pounds of beef, 2 billion pounds of pork, and nearly 100 million barrels of wheat flour. Canning factories operated 24 hours a day. Refrigerated trains crossed the country in long, seamless lines. Even at the height of the war, U.S. troops complained more about boredom with repetitive menus than about shortages. In Germany, by contrast, the supply crisis was catastrophic. Allied bombing crippled rail networks, factories struggled to operate without fuel, agricultural output plummeted as millions of young men were drafted and fertilizers were diverted to explosive production. By late 1943, rations for frontline German soldiers, officially part of the Ernährungsstufen system, were severely reduced. Meat disappeared from most units' diets except on holidays. Bread, once a pillar of German nutrition, thinned into dark loaves padded with fillers, potato flour, ground barley, even cellulose. Soldiers on the Eastern Front resorted to trading valuables with civilians or eating horses to survive. Meanwhile, in America's POW camps, German prisoners saw something that felt like another world. White bread, soft, uniform, and baked in industrial quantities, was placed on their trays daily. In Germany, white bread had become a rarity, reserved for hospitals and officers. Meat was served at least once a day, sometimes twice. Potatoes appeared in nearly every meal. Coffee, real coffee, not ersatz barley substitutes, was brewed in giant urns and refilled without hesitation. And above all, the quantity was overwhelming. One Camp Swift prisoner later recalled, "The Americans served us enough food for 2 men. We could not finish it at first. Some of us hid portions in our barracks thinking the supply would stop." But it never stopped. The United States simply had too much. Wartime rationing existed for civilians, but it never approached the deprivation Europe experienced. When shortages appeared, like sugar or certain cuts of meat, Americans compensated with substitutes, but they never faced near starvation. And because the U.S. Army measured success in calories per soldier per day, its POW feeding system absorbed those same standards.
Logisticians who planned troop rations simply increased quantities to account for the captive population. German POWs unknowingly became beneficiaries of the same overbuild everything philosophy that powered American shipyards, airplane factories, and ammunition plants. They also benefited from something else: the American belief that well-fed prisoners were easier to manage, less violent, and more productive. POWs often worked on farms, in canneries, or in lumber yards, earning small wages while substituting for American laborers drafted into the military. Well-fed workers were efficient workers. And on a deeper level, the United States wanted to contrast its treatment of POWs with what Germany was doing in Europe. Reports of German abuse, especially towards Soviet prisoners, were well known in Washington. By adhering strictly to the Geneva Rules, the U.S. hoped to set a moral example and protect American soldiers held in German camps. But whatever the intention, the result for the individual POW was the same. The meals in front of them were unlike anything they had tasted since the war began. Many wrote in their diaries that the first sign Germany was losing the war was not the battlefield defeats, but the food in the American camps. Food that proved beyond doubt that the United States had resources Germany could never match. At Camp Algona, a former Afrika Korps sergeant summed up the sentiment of thousands of POWs. "When I saw the food, I realized the war was over. Any nation that can feed its prisoners this well cannot be defeated." And so the shock these men felt was not just culinary, it was existential. Their plates had become evidence of the entire war's imbalance. The Wehrmacht might have had skill, discipline, and battlefield experience, but America had something far more decisive: an inexhaustible arsenal of calories, steel, fuel, and food. The prisoners didn't yet understand all the implications, but they sensed the truth. Their captivity was going to be very different from the war they had left behind. Many began to rethink not just their expectations, but their entire image of the enemy. And the meals served to them, simple, plentiful, and unmistakably American, became the first step in reshaping how thousands of German soldiers understood the world beyond the Reich.
For German POWs who had braced themselves for starvation or brutality, life inside American camps unfolded with a surreal mixture of discipline, monotony, and unexpected comfort. After the initial shock of the food wore off, they began to notice the details. The rhythms of a system built not on revenge, but on procedure, efficiency, and a strict adherence to the rules of war. Each camp varied in size and layout, but most shared the same structure. Long rows of wooden barracks, a central parade ground, a mess hall large enough to feed thousands, guard towers, barbed wire fences, and a sprawling complex of workshops, recreation fields, and agricultural lots. At Camp Butner in North Carolina, mornings began with a whistle at 6 a.m. The men filed out for roll call, often surprised by how relaxed the guards were. There were rules and consequences, of course, but the atmosphere was nothing like the terror-driven camps the Nazi regime operated in Europe. After roll call came breakfast: oatmeal, fruit, eggs when available, bread and coffee, followed by work assignments. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted POWs could be compelled to work. Officers could not, as long as the labor did not directly support the U.S. war effort. So they found themselves doing everything around the war: cutting timber, harvesting corn, repairing fences, assembling furniture, working in canneries, or helping with cotton and wheat fields. Many German prisoners were farm boys from Bavaria, Württemberg, or East Prussia. To them, American agriculture was astonishing. The tractors were bigger, the fields were straighter, the silos towered above anything they had seen in Germany. The sheer abundance of equipment, fuel, and produce defied belief. More than one prisoner wrote, "In America, even the soil seems richer." They earned small wages, 80 cents a day in canteen credits, which they could spend on additional food, razor blades, stationery, or cigarettes. Cigarettes, in particular, became the unofficial currency of camp life. Beyond work, the camps had routines remarkably normal for men who expected imprisonment to feel like a cage. There were libraries stocked with English and German books, movie nights showing Hollywood films, and even music rooms where POWs formed orchestras or small jazz bands. At Camp Algona, the POWs built a full nativity scene, an elaborate, hand-carved wooden Christmas diorama with moving parts, using only scrap wood and improvised tools.
It remains preserved in Iowa to this day. Sports became a central part of daily life. Soccer fields filled with cheering crowds. Some camps formed full leagues with printed schedules. Baseball fascinated the Germans, though many found it incomprehensible. Volleyball, boxing, and track races filled the afternoons. In Camp Swift, Texas, German prisoners grew so skilled at their soccer program that local American teams began challenging them to matches, games the POWs often won. For many prisoners, the greatest shock was not simply the comfort, but the trust they were gradually shown. Under guard supervision, POWs were transported to nearby farms where they worked long days harvesting crops desperately needed on the home front. Local farmers often offered them lemonade or snacks, still startled by the idea that the enemy spoke politely, worked diligently, and behaved with professionalism. Some German POWs even established friendships with American civilians, something nearly unthinkable under Nazi ideology. Letters that made it through censors revealed another truth. For many POWs, life in the American camps was the first time they had felt physically secure since the war began. No artillery, no freezing trenches, no constant fear of strafing aircraft. Just routine, food, work, and rest. Weight gain became so common that U.S. medical officers documented it in official reports. At Camp Butner, many prisoners gained an average of 10 to 15 pounds in their first 3 months. One doctor noted that the men arriving from the Afrika Korps were sunburned, underweight, and dehydrated, but recovered rapidly due to regular meals and low stress. But this comfort also generated emotional conflict. Many POWs felt guilty knowing that their comrades on the Eastern Front were starving. Others experienced shame that their captors treated them better than their own army had. A few hardened Nazis tried to enforce ideological discipline within the barracks, attacking prisoners they believed were becoming soft or friendly towards Americans. These internal conflicts sometimes escalated into violence, forcing U.S. guards to separate extremist prisoners into isolated compounds. Yet most POWs, especially those from the Afrika Korps or Western Front, embraced the routine. They learned English, attended optional classes, took correspondence courses, and even studied mathematics, agriculture, or engineering through U.S. extension programs. The war outside continued, brutal and relentless, but inside the camp, a strange equilibrium formed. The German prisoners worked, ate, slept, and waited. Some camp administrators explained why the system worked so smoothly. A fed prisoner is a calm prisoner. A calm prisoner is not a problem. But for the men living inside those fences, the experience was more personal. Their world had collapsed at the front, yet in American captivity, they experienced a daily life that felt, if they allowed it, almost humane. And that humanity would soon set up the starkest contrast of the entire war. How men behind barbed wire in the United States were eating better than German soldiers freezing and starving from Leningrad to the Carpathians. That contrast would reshape their understanding of the war and their understanding of the world they thought they knew.
For every German POW sitting in an American mess hall, cutting into meatloaf or spreading butter across a slice of soft white bread, there came a moment when a thought pierced the comfort like a knife. My comrades at the front are starving. It was not an exaggeration. It was not a metaphor. By 1943 and especially 1944, German soldiers, especially those fighting in the East, were consuming rations so meager that many could not believe the food served in U.S. camps belonged to the same war. The divide between the two worlds became one of the most jarring, emotionally charged contrasts of the entire conflict. While POWs gained weight in Iowa, Texas, and North Carolina, German infantrymen froze in foxholes outside Leningrad, eating crusts of black bread, padded with barley husks, potato peels, or cellulose filler. On the Eastern Front, rations often collapsed to 1,200 to 1,600 calories a day, barely enough to sustain basic function, much less combat. German logistic convoys were destroyed by Soviet partisans. Rail lines were bombed relentlessly. Supply trains never arrived. Field kitchens could not keep fuel for stoves. Meat disappeared entirely for months at a time. Soldiers boiled snow for water and roasted frozen beets if they found any. The Wehrmacht's ration system, once designed to feed a modern army, had decayed into survival-level improvisation. Letters from the front tell the story with brutal clarity.
A soldier in the 18th Army wrote in late 1943, "We fight on empty stomachs. Bread is half sawdust. We dream of potatoes." Another, trapped near Korsun in early 1944, wrote, "The horses are gone. We ate them. Now we eat whatever we can." Diaries from the 6th Army before its destruction at Stalingrad are even harsher. Frozen cabbage soup. One biscuit for the entire day. Sometimes a handful of millet. Many units resorted to slaughtering horses for meat, a grim last resort that symbolized how desperate conditions had become. Against this backdrop, German POWs in America sat in bright mess halls with giant industrial ovens humming behind them. Their plates held beef stew, pork chops, mashed potatoes, beans with ham, and thick slices of bread baked from refined flour, a luxury frontline troops had not seen in years. The POWs did not brag about it. In fact, many felt shame. They spoke quietly about the front, avoiding the subject entirely when the disparity felt too great. One former Afrika Korps sergeant at Camp Swift broke down during a meal, telling a camp cook, "My brother is freezing somewhere in Russia, and you feed me like this." The American replied simply, "It's the law." But laws were only part of the explanation. Behind every POW meal stood the immense machinery of the American home front. Millions of farmers, industrial bakers, meatpacking plants, refrigerated trains, and a logistics system so vast it dwarfed anything the Axis could assemble. U.S. Army rations averaged 3,700 to 4,100 calories, with protein and fat levels far above European norms. And by Geneva Convention standards, POWs had to receive the same quantity and quality of food as American troops. This meant German prisoners ate more generously than German frontline soldiers, often much more. The psychological shock deepened whenever POWs saw American supply convoys rumbling into the camps. Trucks stacked with sacks of flour, crates of oranges, barrels of beef, and tins of butter. Such abundance was unthinkable in wartime Germany. The POWs began to comprehend something they had not realized while fighting, the true scale of the American war machine. A private captured in Normandy later wrote in his memoir, "In the camp, I saw more food in 1 week than our entire company saw in 2 months on the Eastern Front." And the contrast extended beyond calories. It touched identity. German soldiers had been raised on ideals of sacrifice, strength, and endurance. To them, hardship was proof of loyalty. They had eaten thin soups and hard black bread because that was war. Yet here they were, behind American wire, eating better than their own army could feed its best divisions. It shattered illusions. Some prisoners reacted with bitterness, accusing commanders back home of incompetence or betrayal. Others grew angry at Nazi propaganda that had told them Americans were weak, starving, or on the brink of collapse. But the most common reaction was introspective grief, a quiet recognition that Germany had entered a total war it could not sustain, led by men who had gambled millions of lives on a logistical fantasy. On Sundays, when some camps served special meals, roast beef or chicken, other POWs refused to attend, too ashamed to enjoy food they believed their wounded comrades deserved more. But the truth remained. American POW camps were operating at a standard of care unparalleled in the war. The contrast became so notorious that German commanders warned troops not to be captured, fearing they would return home demoralized by the difference. Ironically, the opposite happened. The humane treatment, especially the food, became a pillar of the U.S. Army's post-war re-education efforts, easing prisoners into accepting ideas of democracy, fairness, and rule of law. POWs began to question the Nazi narrative. They wrote to families back home describing food they had not tasted since childhood. Many of these letters, though censored, still contained enough detail to alarm German censors. One report from the German High Command complained, "Prisoners in American hands speak of food better than that issued to our active troops." As winter deepened across Europe in 1944 and POWs in America gained weight, frontline soldiers continued to starve. The contrast was so stark that some prisoners described it as the moment they realized the war was lost, not because of tanks, not because of aircraft, but because of food. The side that controlled the calories controlled the war. And in those camps across North Carolina, Texas, Iowa, and dozens of other states, the German POWs were living inside the proof. By the time the war ended in Europe in May 1945,
The German POWs held in the United States had undergone a transformation far deeper than captivity alone could explain. They had arrived expecting cruelty and starvation. Instead, they found structure, safety, work, and, strangest of all, full plates. What they did not realize, at least not at first, was that the food they ate in those American camps would reshape their identities, their loyalties, and even the future of German-American relations for decades to come. When the war collapsed around Germany, news trickled into the camps slowly, filtered through censors and rumors. Many prisoners spent their evenings sitting on bunk beds, reading letters from home, letters describing burned-out cities, hunger, and the disintegration of the life they had once known. Some men returned from work details to find Red Cross packets confirming that their families were surviving on ration cards barely adequate for winter. The contrast with their own meals in captivity was agonizing. A soldier at Camp Algona wrote, "We are fed like kings while our mothers stand in line for bread." Another recorded, "It breaks the heart. We are safe. They are not." When the U.S. began its formal re-education programs, the intellectual disarmament of Germany, as officials called it, the humane treatment of POWs became an unexpected asset. Army psychologists and educators quickly discovered that men who felt respected were more open to questioning the ideology they had been raised with. And nothing felt more like respect than being fed well. Food spoke a language that propaganda never could. It communicated stability, abundance, and above all, fairness. In dozens of interviews after the war, former POWs said the same thing. The first moment they doubted Nazi propaganda was not during a lecture or a discussion. It was during an American meal. One recalled, "When they gave us the same food they gave their own soldiers, I realized they saw us as human beings." Another said simply, "I learned democracy in the mess hall." Many prisoners began attending voluntary classes offered inside the camps, English lessons, civics courses, agriculture seminars, engineering workshops. They listened to American teachers explain how the U.S. government worked, how freedom of the press functioned, how elections were held. The food gave them the emotional space to listen. The lack of fear allowed them to think. And the consistency of their treatment broke the mental walls that Nazi ideology had built around them. By 1946, as the U.S. prepared to repatriate most POWs, many faced a complicated mix of relief and reluctance. They wanted to see their families again, but they also feared returning to a homeland shattered by war and hunger. Some even volunteered to stay longer to finish agricultural contracts, hoping to delay the return to uncertainty. Others applied for immigration after release, inspired by the fairness they had seen. When they did finally go home, they carried with them stories that seemed unbelievable to many Germans. Stories of American guards who treated them with dignity, of farmers who shared lemonade during harvest breaks, of libraries, sports leagues, and movie nights. And of food, endless food, served to the enemy without bitterness. These stories spread quickly through the ruins of post-war Germany. They softened attitudes toward the occupying forces. They helped foster the first threads of trust that would later become the foundation of West Germany's alignment with the United States during the Cold War. Historians looking back often point out that America did not set out to win hearts and minds through food. The policy came from the Geneva Convention and from America's own logistical abundance. But intention mattered less than outcome. In practice, feeding German POWs well accomplished something extraordinary. It created tens of thousands of witnesses who could return to Germany and say with first-hand authority that the United States had behaved honorably, even toward its enemies. For the POWs themselves, the legacy was often personal. Many wrote memoirs describing captivity in America as the most stable period of their wartime lives. Some returned to visit the towns near their former camps, seeking out the families who had shown them kindness. Others built new lives in America, drawn back by a memory of dignity they had not expected from a foe. And in almost all of their recollections, food played a central role. Not because it was luxurious, it was simple American cooking, but because it represented something profound, a nation so powerful and so secure that it could afford to treat its captives better than many armies treated their own troops. When scholars analyze the collapse of Nazi loyalty among POWs, they often point to lectures, films, or textbooks. But the prisoners themselves tell a different story. Loyalty did not break in classrooms. It broke in mess halls, in the quiet astonishment of a man who had not eaten a full meal in weeks, sitting down to a plate of meat, potatoes, bread, and coffee in a country he had been told was starving. And so the story of German POW rations in the United States is not just about food or logistics. It is a story about the moral power of abundance, about the unexpected strength of compassion in wartime, about how a simple act, feeding a prisoner well, can change the arc of a life, reshape a belief, and ripple outward into the history of nations. Behind the barbed wire, thousands of German soldiers discovered something they had never imagined, that the enemy they fought was not the monster their leaders had described, but a nation that upheld its own values even when no one was watching. And in that discovery, the nightmarish world they had lived in began, piece by piece, to crumble.